Hey everybody, my name is Deja and welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing a 2023 reading survey. This is actually two different tags that were combined together by one of my friends, Haley, from Haley Hughes, and I decided to take her questions that she combined from two different tags and do it myself because it seemed really fun. So I am really excited to be going over all these different things, kind of like superlatives for the year, and I think it's just going to be so much fun. The first question is, how many books have I read this year? And so far I read 148. I'm hoping to hit 150. I have a couple days left in the year from the time that I'm filming this, so I'm hoping to hit 150 by the end of the year, which is the most that I've ever read. This is actually the most that I've ever read in general. Besides this, I've read 120 books. That is the most that I've read in a year besides this year, so I've surpassed that by quite a bit. Then the second question is, what is your most read genre? And it's not going to be a surprise to anybody. My most read genre this year was horror, coming in with 60 books, and then I think romance was second, and then thrillers was third, because I do read quite a bit of romance as well, and I do love romance, so I'm glad that I was able to keep it at its second place. It used to be my #1 most read genre, so it has bumped down to second, but I love horror so much, so I'm happy that I was able to read quite a bit of it this year. The next question is, what was your longest read of the year? And for me, that was Uzumaki by Junji Ito. This is a manga, and this is 653 pages long, so it's quite lengthy, but it is a manga, so it's fast to read. But this one follows a town that is being haunted by spirals, and we follow one specific girl and the impacts that these spirals are having on her life and the people around her. It's really, really good. It creeped me out a ton. It's one of my favorite books of the year. I gave it 5 stars. It was phenomenal, and I just adored it so much. And the shortest book that I read this year is All I Want by Alexandria House, coming in at 24 pages. And this one is a short little Christmas novella that I ended up giving 3 stars because of some mental health representation that wasn't my favorite. But it is kind of like a second chance romance, and I do enjoy second chance romances a lot. But again, the mental health aspect of it just was not my favorite, so I gave it 3 stars. The next question is your favorite book of 2023, and for me, that was All the Sinners Bleed by S.A. Cosby. I love this one. I just posted my favorite books of the year not too long ago, and this is my absolute favorite book of the year. I wanted to make sure that I had one answer for this. I do have a couple other books that came very, very close to tying with this one, but I decided that this one is my absolute favorite of the year. I adore this one so much, and I enjoy S.A. Cosby's writing so much. Sean Andre, I love him. This one follows a black sheriff in a small town, and there has been very little crime in this town in general, but barely any underneath his 1 year of being the sheriff. But there eventually is like a school shooting that happens where a ex-student shoots a teacher, and they are trying to uncover why this happened, because the student then committed suicide and killed themselves, so they have no really real answers for why the student decided to kill their teacher. And as they are kind of discovering what happened, and our main character Titus is kind of trying to uncover everything, he actually unearths these secrets in the town, and possibly a serial killer that has also been living under this town that nobody really has been paying attention to. It is very, very good. It has a lot of trigger warnings. It's kind of like if S.A. Cosby wrote a Karen Slaughter kind of like Grant County book. As I said, it has a detective perspective in it, and it still has kind of like that fast-paced kind of writing style that S.A. Cosby has, and it has a lot of characterization. I feel like both Karen Slaughter and S.A. Cosby have very good characterization, but I love his characterization so much. I don't know how he does it, but S.A. Cosby really is able to make me care about characters that are very, very different from me and have very different life experiences than me. And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but it's really hard for me to relate to men specifically, and all of his main characters in all the books that I've read by him have been men, and they're all like tend to be a little bit older, and that's just like not me, you know, like I'm not a man, I'm not a little older, like I'm not around their age range, so I would find it generally really hard to connect to the characters because they are very different from me. But he always writes characters that I really connect to a lot, and I was really able to connect to Titus in this story a lot, and I loved the like serial killer element. I loved the secrets that were being unearthed in this small town. I love like a detective or like sheriff perspective, and even though I'm not like a fan of the police at all, I think that there is kind of like a nuanced conversation around that in this book, and that I really, really enjoyed. So yeah, S.A. Cosby, he has to take the cake on this one. Then the next question is the best debut that I read this year, and for me, I'm going with Monstrilio. I love this one so much. This is grief horror at its finest, and we follow different perspectives. We follow like the mother, the father, and a couple other perspectives related to this child. And this child actually was born with only one lung and it was underdeveloped, and so they were supposed to die almost instantly after birth, but they have lasted several years, and I believe they die somewhere around like 10 or 11, and they die right at the beginning of this book. And in this culture, I believe it's based on Mexican culture, there is kind of like this lore that you can take part of somebody and nurture it and it'll grow, and a lot of people don't necessarily believe in it, but they still kind of take parts of their loved ones that have passed away and keep them like fingers and stuff like that. So the mother in this book takes part of the lung that this child had and begins to nurture it, and it develops into something else that they then call Monstrilio. It's a sentient being, and they're kind of weirded out because now they have to take care of this other creature, and like, is this really their son? Is it not their son? What exactly is it? And how are they going to take care of it? And it is very different from a human, but it still also has like a consciousness and the kind of complexity that comes with that. It was very interesting, and I enjoyed this one a lot with the perspectives, how it was done. It doesn't alternate perspectives. It'll have the mother's perspective for a little bit, and then it'll switch to like the dad, and then it'll have him for a little bit, and then it'll switch to like a friend, and it'll have them for a little bit. And so we never go back in perspectives. We always just have a perspective for a little bit, and then we move on to a different one, which I really enjoyed a lot. And I enjoyed seeing this exploration of all these different people and how grief is impacting them all differently. It was just such an amazing read that I highly recommend if you can handle the grief content. Next up is my favorite backlist book, and I was trying to have a lot of different like answers for each of these questions. For me, my favorite backlist book was Tender is the Flesh, and this one I absolutely loved because again, it has something to say. I love horror that has something to say, and so this one is following a man who works in a meat processing plant, but in this world, animal meat has actually become toxic to humans, so instead of just giving up meat altogether, they begin to farm humans. Our main character, as I said, he works at a meat processing plant, and he begins to kind of have some emotions and kind of curiosity and differences related to the job that he's doing and meat and animals and humans and what that really means. And I love in this world how humans are pitted against each other with predator and prey. I thought it was done really well, and I thought this was a big metaphor for capitalism to me, and I hate capitalism so much, so the fact that I was able to relate this to an issue that I'm really passionate about, I meant a lot to me. I think that this book actually has like so many different interpretations that you can take from it, and that is something that I really enjoy about it, is I feel like me and somebody else could read this book and come out with completely different ideas of what it was trying to say. And I think that this has a lot of nuanced discussions, and I wish that I read this for like a book club or something like that, because I feel like it would have so many great discussions that you can have around this book, and it just has so much to say, and I love it so much, and I can't wait to read more of this author's work. Next up is what book lived up to the hype, and for me that is going to be Slewfoot by Braun. This is another one of my favorite books, and this one definitely lived up to the hype for me because everybody that I know has like given this book 5 stars, absolutely adored it. It has like a 4.2 or something on Goodreads. This is an absolutely beloved book, especially on BookTube, so I was a bit nervous going into this one, but I absolutely loved it, and it really took me by storm. This follows our main character Abatha, and she is living in Connecticut in 1666, and she has been recently widowed, but there is a lot of gaslighting and horrible things that men are doing to her within this community, including her own husband, her relatives. Everybody is kind of taking advantage of her being a woman and what that means, but she's very strong-willed, and a lot of people don't like that about her, and she was not originally part of this community. She married into it, so the community kind of shuns her away, and they also live on the outskirts of the community, so they don't go to like the religious ceremonies and stuff like that as much as everybody else. So they really just look down upon her and her husband, but as I said, her husband passed away towards the beginning of this book, and so she is kind of left with the estate of her husband, but she is also left very isolated because even though her husband kind of played into the beliefs of everybody else, he did still care about her and did take care of her, and now she's left completely alone and isolated, and everybody in the community is shunning her. So she turns to this creature that woke up in the middle of the woods called called Slewfoot, and they have no idea what they are, where they came from, any of their history. They basically have amnesia, and they are also being isolated because they know that nobody's going to accept them because they are different. And so they turn to each other in this time to find solace in each other, and it kind of devolves from there. It is a slower read, but at the end it has a very much like good for her vibes, which I absolutely adored. It really shocked me because nobody really talks about that in this book. Nobody really frames it as that, and it definitely is a good for her book, which I really enjoy a lot. And I just think that this idea combined with that good for her kind of element was so different, and I never have read anything else like it, and I absolutely loved it. If you're looking for a witch book and you can handle kind of like the triggers, but you want like a classic like witch, like hocus pocus kind of book, this is going to be the book for you. Next question is, what book did you read this year that did not live up to the hype? And I actually have a whole disappointing / worst books video that also went up a couple days ago, and so I have one book from there and one book that I completely forgot to put on that list, and I don't know how, but I'm going to talk about both. And the first one is one that I did put on that list, and that is Pen Pal by Dathan Arkovich. This one is one that is super beloved and just like adored on BookTube, like Slewfoot. So I thought, again, like this is going to be one that I absolutely adore and love, but it just wasn't. We follow a man, and he's kind of looking back on memories in his childhood and kind of noticing some weird, strange things that were kind of going on in his childhood, specifically related to this pen pal that he had from his childhood that they got during school. This one, to me, just like nothing happened. Like I feel like I knew nothing more than I knew at the very beginning, and it is actually originally was like a creepypasta, and I feel like you could definitely kind of get those vibes from this story. And I feel like creepypastas do kind of like leave you with some creepiness, but at the end of it you still don't really know what's going on, and that's what's so creepy about them, is that your own mind is kind of taking over and kind of develop these really crazy ideas of what could have been going on. But I feel like because this one was extended to make a full-length book, that it just did not work for me personally. And I don't really enjoy creepypastas in general, but I can appreciate them in a short form. But because this one was so long, it felt like it was just dragging on and on and on and on for no payoff, when in creepypastas they're so short that it doesn't really matter that there is not as much payoff in the end. But this one, because it again was full length, it just didn't really hit the same way for me. Another book that was really disappointing for me was Everything the Darkness Eats by Eric LaRocca, because I love Eric LaRocca. Every single thing that I've read from them I've loved. I've given 4.5 stars. I've adored them. They are literally my favorite author of all time. I adore their work so much, and this one was just such a disappointment for me because I didn't enjoy it. I gave it 3 stars, which is still an okay rating, but for Eric LaRocca I was like, okay, why are we getting a 3-star from Eric? I feel like I'm actually really bad at describing this one, so I'm going to read y'all the synopsis on the back. It says, after a recent string of disappearances in a small Connecticut town, a grieving widower with a grim secret is drawn into a dangerous ritual of dark magic by a powerful and mysterious older gentleman named Hart Crowley. Meanwhile, a member of local law enforcement tasked with uncovering the culprit responsible for the bizarre disappearances soon begins to learn of a current of unbridled hatred simmering beneath the guise of the town's idyllic community, a hatred that will eventually burst and forever change the lives of those who once found peace in the quiet town of Hensley's Edge. And so this one, it sounds really good, like this magic. It has a lot to talk about homophobia. That's kind of like the unbridled hatred simmering that they're talking about, because the member of law enforcement actually recently moved to this town and they are gay. They have a husband. The hatred that they're talking about is definitely that homophobia that's woven into the town, and it just sounds so good, but something about it just did not work for me. I can't really describe why, but it just didn't click. And I don't think that this is a bad book, and I could see people enjoying this one, but it just did not work for me personally. Next up is, what book felt like the biggest accomplishment when you finished reading it? And I have 2 for this one as well, and the first one is Uzumaki, which I already went over, but this was the first manga that I ever read, and it is a bit lengthy. So when I finally finished this one, I was like, oh my god, like I finally finished my first manga, which I was a little intimidated by. So this one just like really made me happy that I was able to finish it. And then the other one is actually a manhwa, Killing Stalking, and this one, not only was I accomplished because I finished a manhwa, which this is my first manhwa, but I also felt accomplished because I remember when I went to buy this, because I heard about it from Rose, and I heard about this one from my friend Rose, and then I was like, okay, like I really want to read it, and I went to the bookstore, and my roommate was kind of like, oh my gosh, Deja, like I would never read that book, like that's crazy, like it's really insane, like it's very triggering. And I was like, girl, like I'm fine, like I read extreme horror, like I'm good. But I still was like, okay, a little wary of reading this one. So I was like, okay, so I'm a little scared now, but I ended up finishing it and I loved it. It was so good. This one follows a guy who ends up having this crush and kind of giving like yandere type vibes, where he ends up stalking this crush, and it's like a guy from his past where they kind of went to school together, they were in like the army together and stuff like that, but he was never really recognized by the other guy, and he just like kind of admired him from a distance. But he begins stalking him, and he breaks into his house. He finds a woman tied up and naked. So yeah, as that happens, the other guy that he has a crush on comes home and knocks him out. And when our main character Yoonbum wakes up, he's like, okay, like I know that you have this woman tied up, but like I low-key kind of love you. And so the other guy, Sang-woo, ends up taking Yoonbum as his sex slave. It's very crazy, very triggering. Please make sure to look up trigger warnings. It literally says on the back, like, I don't know if y'all can see, but it has like warning, parental advisory, explicit content. It literally says like mature. It has all these warnings on it. So I would definitely be careful going into it, but I really adored it. Next up is who's your favorite character that you read from this year? And that has to be for me, Vesper from Black Sheep. I love Black Sheep so much, and it definitely was a surprise for me. I did not anticipate loving it as much as I did. Black Sheep follows our main character Vesper, and she was a part of this cult when she was growing up, but she ended up leaving. And this is the type of cult where like when you leave, you cannot be invited back for like birthdays, weddings, funerals, anything. Once you're out, like how most cults are. She ends up actually getting an invitation to one of her family members' weddings, and she ends up realizing that she needs to go back because the family member is actually getting married to Vesper's ex. And so she feels this betrayal on both sides, from her ex and from her family member, because obviously, why are you marrying her ex? Like that's crazy. And she ends up going back, and she was invited back for a reason. It was not a coincidence that she just ended up getting this invitation. It was definitely for a reason. And this one gives kind of like Chilling Adventures of Sabrina vibes. That's what I keep saying, like season 1, season 2 of that show. It has those kind of vibes, especially with a big event kind of at the center of the show, and the book both have that, and I loved it so much. But Vesper is like this very cynical 20-something-year-old, and like I just really related to her, but also she reminds me a lot of my sister, and my sister is a much more like cynical than me, and so she reminded me a lot of myself, but a lot of my sister as well. So I just loved Vesper so much. Next up is what is your least favorite character that you read this year? And for me, that has to be All the Characters in a Twisted Love Story by Samantha Downing. I read this book for the Literally Dead book club. I was in the live show, and this one I kind of was trying to defend it at first. I was like, it's not that bad, because it was a little entertaining, but this is just white people doing white people shit, okay? It literally has two characters, and they are in a tumultuous relationship where they constantly are breaking up, getting back together, breaking up, getting back together. It's very toxic and stuff like that, and they start to have a police officer kind of on their trail looking at them a little bit, mostly because they believe that it's a domestic abuse situation, but both sides are just as terrible as each other, and they are kind of wary about this police officer kind of paying attention to them, because back when years ago when they broke up one time, somebody ended up dead, and they had been keeping this hidden for years. And you would think, okay, this is a twisted love story, it's supposed to be toxic, it's supposed to be this, it's supposed to be that. And I'm not saying that in reality, if this was to happen in real life, it wouldn't not be toxic. Of course, I'd be like, if my friend was in this situation, I'd be like, girl, just break up with him, because this is very horrible, like both of y'all. But in this one, I wanted it to be really toxic. I wanted it to be off the charts, and to me it just wasn't that. I read much more toxic relationships than this, even in just like thrillers, romance, all of it, and it just did not have the toxicity that I was looking for, because the characters would do little things like, oh, she's like, oh, he doesn't eat red meat, so I'm ordering order a steak, or like he doesn't like this color so I'm gonna wear that color dress. Like things like that for the most part was like the little toxic things that they were doing, and I was like, okay, y'all are just annoying me. And they were just bland white people, so like I just could not stand any of the characters. And yeah. Question number 13 is, what is the most shocking book that you read in 2023? And for me, that was The Perfect Marriage by Geneva Rose, because this one not only shocked me with the twist, and especially at the very end, this had me gagged and gooped and glumped, but this shocked me because I didn't anticipate to love it as much as I did it. This was in my top 10 of the year, guys. Like, I'm not kidding when I say that I actually really love this book. We follow a woman, and she is a high profile defense attorney, and her husband actually ends up getting arrested on charges that he murdered his mistress. And this is the first time that she's finding out that he has a mistress, but she does not believe that her husband actually murdered the mistress. So she basically is like, okay, the only person that can defend you is me, because there's a lot of incriminating evidence. So she ends up defending her own husband against the murder of his mistress, when obviously she feels betrayed because he had a mistress. And this one was so good. It had so many twists and turns throughout the entire book. I was constantly gagged. Like I was like all the time, and that's how it pulled me out of a reading slump. And then the very end really shocked me, and then I was shocked in general because I didn't anticipate to love this one, because this is like a TikTok overhyped book, and a lot of people were like, okay, like the book was not as good as the TikTok girlies made it out to be, like how it normally is, but I loved it. I really did. Next up is your OTP / favorite couple for the year, and for me that was Gwen and Tony from What a Match. This one is amazing. Gwen is a woman who is like getting up there in age to her in her mind. I don't think so, but she was like getting close to 30 or just like hit 30, and so she's like, okay, I need to find the love of my life, like I have to. And so she ends up getting into a matchmaking service, and then Tony on the other hand runs a boxing gym with Gwen's brother, and he ends up having some apartment troubles and lands on Gwen's couch. So they kind of known each other for years, but Tony's kind of grumpy and kind of like off-puttish, and so Gwen has never really been interested in him, but Tony definitely has an interest in Gwen, and they end up bonding through this time that they are kind of like stuck together in the same apartment. They end up having a romance, and it's just so good, and they're definitely like my OTP of the year. I love them as a couple. I love them as individuals. They're just so cute and adorable. Next up is the best written book that you read this year, and for me that one has to be Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This one almost made it into my honorable mentions for my top 20 of the year. If I did my top 23 of the year, it definitely would have been on there for sure. I loved this one a lot. This one I'm sure you've heard about because it's been a very popular book, where we follow our main character. She went to like college with this other woman, and like they were both trying to become writers, and the one that's not our main character basically became super famous and is super like beloved, while our main character has been basically like fighting for her life. Like nobody wants her books kind of flop, like they're just doing terribly. And then the other woman ends up dying in the presence of our main character. Our main character ends up taking the manuscript of the other woman, and the other woman was Asian, our main character is white, and she basically edits the manuscript and publishes it as her own. And the book has to do with like the Chinese experience. They kind of make her have like a racially ambiguous name, and she basically commits Yellowface, where she is trying to publish this book and pass it off as an Asian woman writing the book, when it was really her, and she stole it from her friend who is dead. So it's very terrible, but I think that this was a amazingly plotted book and an amazingly written book, and I think that R.F. Kuang knew exactly what she was doing. Every single word on the page meant something. I think you could definitely tell though that R.F. Kuang definitely has an expertise in the writing. Even when they were talking about the book within the book, that one you could tell that she even had to do research for that, and it just really, you could tell that R.F. Kuang put a lot of her heart and soul into this story and into the writing of this book. Next up is the book that you pushed the most people to read in 2023, and for me that has to be Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This is the very first book that I read of the year, and it has stuck with me and been one of my absolute favorites. We follow a woman who goes down to an expedition underneath the ocean for a while, and she gets stuck there with no communication to the outside world, and they are stuck there way longer than they're supposed to be. So then she ends up coming up eventually, once she is up onto the surface, we follow her wife as she is dealing with the changes that her wife has now gone through and her just being very different. So we get dual perspectives of the wife who was underneath the ocean and then the wife who is trying to take care of her afterwards. And this book is just so good. I absolutely adore and love it. It is a short little horror book, which is some of my favorites, and I love ocean horror so much that I just absolutely adored this one. And I think because this was my first read of the year, that a lot of people have taken this recommendation from me, and I just love this one so much. So if you like short ocean horror that has something to say. Next up is your favorite cover of 2023, and I wanted to pick one that I actually have read this year, and for me that has to be Vanessa Jerry's Got a Man. I don't normally like people on covers, but something about the illustration on this cover I just really love, and I don't know, I just really love this cover a lot. And I think it's just like the art style and the way that they're looking at each other, and I feel like you could really like see a lot of like heart and personality in their eyes, and I just think the art in this is so beautiful. Cry the hardest. Next up is the book that made you cry the hardest, and for me that has to be Monstrilio. This one had so much grief where I literally was tearing up talking about this in my wrap up the month that I read it, because it just meant so much to me, and I can't imagine like that pain, because I have never really lost somebody that close to me. That is like one of my biggest fears, is like losing a family member or like a friend. I have lost a couple friends in my life, but never like a family member or somebody that was like super duper like absolutely like my best friend or anything like that. And so I just can't imagine that type of pain, and it's a big fear of mine. So this one definitely made me cry a little bit. I don't think any other book really made me cry the entire year besides this one. And then next up is the book that made you laugh the hardest, and for this one I'm going with The 7 Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This one also kind of made me tear up just a little bit, because this one definitely has to do with some grief as well, but this one also had me like kicking my feet, like giggling. Like I didn't really have a book that made me laugh out loud this year, like because it was just so funny, but I definitely had some books that made me kick my feet, and this was one of them. And so this one follows our main character, and she was really close with her aunt, and her aunt ends up passing away due to suicide. So she ends up inheriting the apartment that her aunt had. When she shows up there, there's actually a man living there, but he's living there 7 years in the past, because this apartment actually has some like time traveling kind of properties to it. He is a up and coming chef, and then she is trying to find him in current day 7 years in the future for him. And it was just so cute and so good, but it still had a lot of heart to it and something to say, which is like some of my favorite in romance. Next up is the best book to movie adaptation, and honestly I have not really seen that many this year, and I definitely have not read many books that were adapted this year. But for me, I'm gonna go with The Ballads of Songbirds and Snakes, even though I have not read that book, but I plan on rereading all of the Hunger Games next year, and then hopefully reading The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes as well, because I'm really missing the Hunger Games. That's like one of the series that got me back into reading and reading the way that I do, and finding booktube was the Hunger Games, so I'm feeling very nostalgic for it, and I just really miss and love the series. But I loved being back in the world with the movie, and I rewatched like 1.5 movies. I got through the first movie and half of Catching Fire, and I just loved being in that world again, and I loved The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Even though it was like kind of long, I really liked it. Next up is what are some new favorite authors that you've discovered this year, and this one was not a discovery this year, but I feel like for me, for an author to be a favorite author, I can't just have read one book from them, I have to read multiple. So one that did show up this year was S.A. Cosby. I have read 3 of his 4 backlist books now. I read 1 last year, and then I read 2 this year, and he has quickly become one of my favorites. I love his work so much. If you're curious, for me this one is first, then Razorblade Tears, and then Blacktop Wasteland, and I haven't read My Darkest Prayer yet, but I really am excited to, because I want to read all of his work, because I just love it so much. And as I said, I love his characterization and how he makes me feel about these characters. And even though his books are kind of like fast-paced action movies, which are not like movies or type of books that I enjoy, something about S.A. Cosby's writing and the way that he executes books just really works for me. So he has quickly shot up to being one of my favorite authors of all time. And then another one that I discovered this year for the first time and read from first this year was Mimi Grace. I have read 2 of her books now. I read the first and second book in the Love Struck series, which is the series that has What a Match in it. I just read the second book, and I absolutely loved the first and the second one. I love them so much, and I love Mimi Grace's writing, and I can't wait to continue on with more books of hers. And I did want to talk about my most read author this year, and my most read author this year was actually Eric LaRocca. Again, I read 4 of Eric LaRocca's works this year, and I love their work so much. So yeah, I thought that would be really fun to bring up, but Eric LaRocca has been known to be one of my favorite authors of all time anyways. The second to last question that I have is your favorite nonfiction book that you read this year, and I read 3 nonfiction books this year, and I cannot choose between them because 2 of them are memoirs and one of them is like really important, so I cannot choose between them. So the very first one that I want to talk about is It Came From the Closet, and this is Queer Reflections on Horror, where it is 25 contemporary queer and trans writers reflect on the horror films that shaped them and shook them. And I love this one so much. Even if you haven't watched all the movies that they're talking about, which I definitely have not, I feel like this talks about queerness related to horror so much. But this one, I think if you are queer or an ally and you love horror and you want to like talk about queerness in horror, specifically even in horror movies that don't explicitly state that they are queer, but how queerness relates to them, because queerness and horror just go together, I think that this one is a great one. And then I also read Know My Name by Chanel Miller, which is obviously about Chanel Miller and how she was impacted by the sexual assault that happened to her. And this one is super important, and I think that if you can handle the trigger warnings, that this one is a great memoir. I related to this one a lot in a lot of different ways that you would not even anticipate for me, but I really just enjoyed this one because I was able to relate to it so much. And then the last one was actually the first nonfiction book I read this year. I read it back in January, and it's I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This one was phenomenal. I love this one so much. We follow Jeanette McCurdy from Nickelodeon. Obviously you probably know her from like iCarly and Sam and Cat, and this one talks about how she was basically abused by her own mother and how her mom pushed her to act and do all these different things that she didn't want to, and then how she had this very like toxic codependent relationship with her mother. And when her mom died, it kind of set her down a spiral of like drugs and alcohol and all this different stuff. And now looking back on it, she's glad that her mom died because her mom was very abusive towards her, and she's glad that she's dead, which I think is a very powerful sentiment to say, because that's your own parent, but parents aren't always good parents, you know what I'm saying? And the last question is your favorite reread of the year, and for me I have 2. So the first one is The Last Housewife by Ashley Winstead. I reread this one this year and I absolutely loved it the second time around. I loved it the first time and the second time. This one is just such an amazing one that has to do with like women and sexual assault and grooming and cults, and it's just so good. Like I can't even describe it. I absolutely love it. And then the other one that I reread this year was Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by Eric LaRocca. I actually read Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes, which includes 2 other short stories, I believe, but I did technically reread this one story, which is like one of my favorite books of all time. I actually got this eye tattoo. It's, y'all can't really see it, it's an eye. I actually got that because of this book. Why did I slap it like that? I got this eye tattoo and I plan on getting more eye tattoos because of this little story, because what have you done to deserve your eyes today? If that intrigues you at all, pick this up. So those are all the answers to these questions. I really enjoyed doing this, so thank you Haley for combining these 2 tags together. And that's all that I have for this video today. I hope that you guys enjoyed. If you made it to the end, leave an eye emoji. It's backwards. Leave an eye emoji down below for this book, and I will see y'all in my next one. Bye everybody. I'm writing rhymes in the kitchen, soaking the moments we live in, yeah. You got the nerve to be on me, faking your life for the